The Galactic Defense Academy had seen its share of disappointments over the cycles, but none quite so beige as Faye Holloway. Oh, don't get the wrong idea. The Academy wasn't in the business of accepting just anyone. You had to pass approximately 18 different death-defying entrance exams just to get your claws, tentacles, or, in Faye's case, boring human feet through the front airlock. But once you were in, well, that's when the real fun began. And by fun, we mean the kind of systematic psychological torture that would make a vegan mind-ripper weep with professional envy. Faye shuffled through the corridor of Block C housing, her regulation boots making the most unremarkable squeaking sounds against the polished metal floors. Around her, the Academy hummed with the controlled chaos of 1,000 different species, trying very hard not to accidentally kill each other during breakfast. The morning alarm had just finished its multi-frequency shriek, designed to wake everything from silicon-based rock creatures to beings made entirely of crystallized sound, and the hallways were filling with the usual suspects. There was Baxthor, all 8 feet of him, his reptilian hide gleaming with that obnoxious sheen that screamed apex predator from birth. His species, the Korath, had conquered their homeworld by the age of 12, individually, not collectively. The guy could probably bench press a small moon, and he made sure everyone knew it by the way he walked. You know the walk. Shoulders back, chest out, tail swishing with the confidence of something that had never met a food chain it couldn't climb to the top of. "Morning, human," Baxthor rumbled as he passed, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for things you might accidentally step on. "Try not to trip over your own feet during combat drills today." Faye offered a weak smile and a little wave. "I'll do my best," which, honestly, was probably the most human response possible. Not a threat, not a challenge, just polite optimism in the face of casual condescension. Baxthor's ridge crest flared with what might have been amusement or disgust. It was hard to tell with Korath facial expressions. The mess hall was its usual symphony of controlled violence disguised as breakfast. The Korath section dominated one corner, their massive forms hunched over slabs of still-twitching protein. The Zenthari had claimed the opposite wall, their crystalline bodies refracting the morning light into rainbow patterns as they absorbed mineral supplements through their skin. And there, floating serenely above it all in the energy being section, was Ix-Illa. Now, Ix-Illa was what you might call intellectually insufferable, but in the most beautiful way possible. Her species, the Lumens, had transcended physical form sometime around the era when humans were still figuring out fire. She existed as pure conscious energy, usually manifesting as a shimmering humanoid outline filled with swirling galaxies. Very impressive, very mystical, very much aware of how impressive and mystical she was. Faye Holloway. Ix-Illa's voice resonated directly inside Faye's skull, because of course it did. Your biometric readings during yesterday's tactical simulation were quaint. Faye looked up from her regulation protein paste, gray, flavorless, and designed to sustain life without providing any actual enjoyment. "Thanks, I think." It was not a compliment. The galaxies inside Ix-Illa's form swirled faster, which in Lumen body language roughly translated to eye-rolling. Your species operates on such limited dimensional parameters. It's fascinating, really, in the way that watching primitive bacteria struggle against entropy might be fascinating. Oh. Faye took another spoonful of paste. Well, bacteria are pretty tenacious when you think about it. Ix-Illa's form flickered, the Lumen equivalent of a confused blink. The morning briefing took place in the Academy's Grand Amphitheater, a massive chamber designed to accommodate every conceivable body type the galaxy might throw at them. Commander Grixhan stood at the center podium, his insectoid form perfectly rigid in that way that made you wonder if he had a steel rod for a spine, or if that was just natural Vrex posture. Grixhan was old-school military. His species had been running disciplined hive armies since before most civilizations had invented the wheel, and he brought that same uncompromising efficiency to the academy. His compound eyes swept across the assembled recruits with a kind of systematic precision that suggested he was cataloging everyone's weaknesses for future reference. Recruits. His voice buzzed through the universal translators, carrying undertones that made your bones itch. In 2 cycles, you will face the trial of worthiness. This is not a test. This is not a simulation. This is your opportunity to prove that you deserve to defend the galaxy, rather than simply occupying space within it. A ripple of anticipation ran through the crowd. Some species bristled with excitement, the Korath especially, their ridge crests flaring in challenge display mode. Others, like the Zenthari, began resonating at frequencies that suggested deep contemplation mixed with mild panic. Faye just sat there looking, well, unremarkable. The trial will take place in Sector 996, Grixhan continued, aboard the derelict research station Prometheus 8. The station has been abandoned for 300 cycles following unfortunate incidents during its operational period. Now that got everyone's attention. Derelict stations were bad enough, but ones abandoned due to unfortunate incidents were the kind of places that showed up in Academy horror stories. The kind of places where previous classes had gone in as confident recruits and come out as cautionary tales. You will work in mixed species teams, Grixhan announced, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. Your performance will determine not only your final rankings, but your survival. Baxthor's tail lashed with barely contained excitement. His ridge crest was now fully extended, which in Korath body language roughly translated to "Bring it on, universe." Around him, his fellow apex predators were displaying similar signs of barely controlled bloodlust. Ixilla's form had shifted to a deeper blue, indicating intense focus. Several smaller lumens had begun orbiting her like moons, their collective intelligence networks probably already running probability calculations for every possible scenario. The Zenthari had started that harmonic humming thing they did when they were nervous, creating a background drone that made your teeth hurt. And Faye? Faye was taking notes, with an actual physical stylus, on an actual physical notepad, like some kind of primitive cave dweller who hadn't discovered quantum data storage yet. "Dismissed," Grixhan buzzed, and the amphitheater erupted into motion. As the recruits filed out, conversations sparked up in a dozen different languages and communication methods. Baxthor was already holding court with his Korath packmates, their voices rumbling with confident predictions about how they'd dominate whatever challenges the station threw at them. The Zenthari had formed their usual geometric discussion patterns, their crystal forms catching and reflecting light as they shared information through harmonic resonance. Ixilla floated past Faye, pausing just long enough to project her thoughts directly into the human's consciousness. "Try not to die immediately, Faye Holloway. Your species' extinction would be inconvenient for galactic diversity statistics." "Thanks for the pep talk," Faye replied cheerfully, still scribbling notes. As the amphitheater emptied, Faye remained in her seat, stylus moving steadily across the notepad. Her handwriting was neat, methodical, and utterly unremarkable, just like everything else about her. But if someone had bothered to look closely at what she was writing, they might have noticed something interesting. She wasn't taking notes about the trial procedures or the station layout, or any of the tactical considerations that should have been occupying a recruit's mind. Instead, her notepad was filled with observations about her fellow students, behavioral patterns, stress responses, the way Baxthor's ridge crest extended when he felt challenged, the harmonic frequencies the Zenthari used for different emotional states, the color shifts in Ixilla's energy form. It was the kind of detailed behavioral analysis that would have impressed a xenopsychology professor, the kind of systematic observation that suggested a mind constantly cataloging and categorizing everything around it. But Faye Holloway was just another recruit. Unremarkable, average, the kind of student who would probably wash out during the first real challenge. At least, that's what everyone assumed. 2 cycles later, As Faye packed her regulation gear bag with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else, her roommate, a silicon-based Teroth named Quarex, watched with something approaching pity. "You know," Quarex said in her grinding stone-on-stone voice, "there's no shame in requesting a transfer to the logistics division. Humans have done quite well in support roles." Faye looked up from her packing, offering that same mild, unremarkable smile. "Oh, I'm sure everything will work out fine." Quarex's rocky features shifted into what might have been a frown. "The Prometheus 8 station, there are stories about that place. Bad stories. Even the Korath war chiefs avoid that sector." "Stories can be pretty unreliable," Faye replied, folding her spare uniform with geometric precision. "People tend to exaggerate when they're scared." "And you're not scared?" Faye paused, stylus halfway to her notepad where she'd been updating her behavioral observations. For just a moment, something flickered behind her eyes. Something that definitely wasn't fear, but wasn't exactly comfort either. "I'm curious," she said finally. Which, as any xenobiologist could tell you, was probably the most dangerous thing a human could be. The Academy's archives were supposedly off-limits to recruits, but off-limits was more of a suggestion than a hard rule, when you knew which maintenance shafts led where. Not that Faye was breaking into anything, mind you. She'd simply asked Quartermaster Gregson very politely if she could access some historical records, and the old mollusk had been so surprised by a human showing intellectual curiosity that he'd granted her research privileges without thinking twice. Now, surrounded by holographic displays showing centuries of Academy history, Faye was learning some very interesting things about the Prometheus 8 station. "Unauthorized access detected in Archive Bay 6, the Academy's AI announced in its perpetually bored voice. "Please report to—" "Oh, it's just you, Recruit Holloway. Carry on." Even the artificial intelligence found her unremarkable. Faye wasn't sure whether to be insulted or impressed by her own invisibility. The historical records painted a picture that would have sent most recruits running for the nearest transport off-world. Prometheus 8 had been a cutting-edge research facility, designed to push the boundaries of what the galaxy understood about consciousness, energy manipulation, and the fundamental nature of predatory instincts. The kind of place where scientists with too much funding and too little supervision asked questions like, what happens if we try to artificially recreate the perfect apex predator? The answer, apparently, was nothing good. The station had operated for roughly 50 cycles before the first incident reports started filtering back to Academy Command. Equipment malfunctions, unexplained power fluctuations, research staff reporting strange dreams and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Standard stuff for a cutting-edge facility, really. Scientists were always complaining about something. But then the disappearances started. Not all at once, mind you. That would have been too obvious. Just one researcher here, one technician there. Always during the night cycle. Always from areas of the station that should have been perfectly safe. The security feeds would show them entering a room or corridor, but never leaving. The final incident report made for particularly grim reading. The entire night shift, 36 beings from 12 different species, had simply vanished. The day shift found empty corridors, abandoned workstations, and one very disturbing addition to the station's database, a new research file labeled the Pale Flame Protocol. The file itself was corrupted beyond recovery, but the fragments that remained painted a picture of something that had emerged from the station's experimental consciousness research, something that the researchers had described as predatory instinct given form, and the fear that fears itself. Poetic, but not particularly helpful. The station had been evacuated immediately after, sealed, and left to drift in the void. Officially, it was listed as hazardous, authorized personnel only. Unofficially, it had become the Academy's go-to location for the kind of trials that separated the truly exceptional from the merely competent. Fascinating reading. Faye looked up to find Ixilla floating behind her, the lumen's energy form casting prismatic patterns across the archive displays. Educational, Faye replied, closing the historical files with a casual tap. Did you know that the Prometheus 8 station was originally designed to study predatory consciousness patterns across species? Of course. Ixila's form shifted to a somewhat condescending shade of gold. My people contributed significant research to that project. We were particularly interested in how different species conceptualize the hunter-prey dynamic. And what did you find? The galaxies within Ixila's form swirled thoughtfully. That every species has a fundamental understanding of what it means to be hunted. Even apex predators carry genetic memories of being prey to something larger, something more dangerous. It's quite universal, really. Even lumens? Ixila's form flickered, that confused blink again. We transcended such primitive concerns when we evolved beyond physical form. But you still have the memories? Faye pressed gently. Somewhere in your species' development, there was something that hunted your ancestors. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, Ixila's voice resonated with something that might have been uncertainty. There are theoretical frameworks that suggest even energy-based consciousness retains certain primal response patterns. Theoretical, Faye repeated, making a note on her ever-present notepad. Why are you researching the station's history? Ixila asked, clearly eager to change the subject. Most recruits are spending their time on tactical preparation or physical conditioning. Faye shrugged. I like to know what I'm walking into. Which was true, as far as it went. But it wasn't the complete truth. Faye wasn't just researching the station's history. She was researching her fellow recruits' psychological profiles, their species' documented fear responses, and their likely behavioral patterns under extreme stress. The kind of comprehensive analysis that would have impressed a military strategist. But Faye Holloway was just another recruit, so it probably wasn't worth mentioning. The next morning brought what the Academy euphemistically called pre-trial conditioning, a series of exercises designed to test recruit readiness and identify any last-minute psychological breaks that might prove inconvenient during the actual trial. Baxthor dominated the physical challenges, naturally. His species had been perfecting the art of combat for millennia, and it showed. He moved through the obstacle courses like violence given form, his massive claws finding purchase on surfaces that should have been impossible to climb. During the combat simulations, he went through holographic opponents like a natural disaster with anger management issues. "Behold!" he announced to anyone within earshot, his ridge crest fully extended in triumph display mode. "This is what true apex predation looks like. My ancestors conquered worlds with nothing but claw and fang." The other Korath recruits rumbled their approval, their own ridge crests flaring in sympathetic dominance displays. Several smaller species took the opportunity to relocate to different areas of the training complex. Ixila approached the mental challenges with a kind of serene confidence that only came from being part of a collective consciousness spanning multiple dimensions. The Academy's most advanced puzzle simulations lasted approximately 30 seconds against her enhanced cognitive processing. Strategic planning exercises that were designed to take hours were completed in minutes. Consciousness unfettered by physical limitations operates on entirely different efficiency parameters, she explained to a somewhat shell-shocked instructor. Your challenges are designed for beings constrained by single-perspective linear thinking. The instructor, a four-armed Kethran with decades of experience, just nodded and made some notes about possibly redesigning the entire curriculum. The Zenthari approached everything with their usual methodical precision, their crystalline forms ringing with harmonic frequencies as they processed each challenge through their collective analytical networks. They didn't dominate any single area, but they were consistently excellent across all parameters. Steady, reliable. The kind of beings you wanted watching your back when everything went sideways. And Faye? Faye was average. Not terrible, not exceptional. She completed the physical challenges without embarrassing herself, solved the mental puzzles with workmanlike competence, and approached each simulation with the kind of mild curiosity you might bring to a moderately interesting museum exhibit. Adequate. was Commander Grixhan's assessment during the post-exercise briefing. His compound eyes fixed on her with the intensity of someone trying to figure out why she was there. Your performance falls within acceptable parameters for a human recruit. High praise, really. That evening, as the recruits gathered in the common areas to process their pre-trial stress in species-appropriate ways, conversation inevitably turned to the legends surrounding their destination. "The Korath have a saying," Baxthor announced, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from being 8 feet of scaled muscle. "Fear is prey behavior. Predators know only hunger and satisfaction." Several of his packmates rumbled agreement, their eyes reflecting the common area's lighting with that unsettling reptilian gleam. "My people have encountered true terror only once in our recorded history," contributed Vexara, a Zenthari whose crystal form was shot through with veins of deep purple. "During the 3rd expansion, our scouts found a system where the very space seemed aware, hostile. Ships would enter the system and simply stop responding to communication." Her harmonic resonance shifted to a frequency that made everyone's teeth ache. "Energy-based entities are theoretically immune to conventional fear responses," Ixilla added, though her usual confidence seemed somewhat muted. "However, there are certain quantum phenomena that can disrupt consciousness patterns in ways that approximate what physical beings might call terror." "What about humans?" asked Quarex, Faye's silicon-based roommate. "What legends do your people have about ultimate predators?" All eyes turned to Faye, who looked up from her notepad with mild surprise. "Oh, we don't really have apex predators on Earth anymore. We kind of outlasted them all." The silence that followed was profound. "Outlasted them?" Baxthor's ridge crest had flattened against his skull, a sign of confusion in Korath body language. "Well, yeah. I mean, there were plenty of things that could kill individual humans. Big cats, bears, that sort of thing. But as a species, we just kept adapting and spreading until we'd basically taken over the whole planet." Faye's tone was conversational, as if she were discussing the weather. "Persistence, mostly, and tools. We're pretty good with tools. But what about primal fear?" Ixilla's form had shifted to an uncertain yellow. "Every species retains genetic memories of being hunted." Faye considered this seriously. "I suppose our biggest fear would be giving up. Humans don't handle hopelessness very well. We tend to get stubborn about it." Another silence. This one lasted long enough to become genuinely uncomfortable. "That's not how apex predator psychology works," Baxthor said finally. "We're not apex predators," Faye replied cheerfully. "We're just really, really persistent." As the evening wore on and the other species drifted back to their quarters, Faye remained in the common area, making notes by the soft light of the observation windows. Outside, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to the small dramas playing out within the Academy's walls. Her notepad was filling up with increasingly detailed observations about stress responses, fear reactions, and the subtle ways each species revealed their deepest anxieties. The kind of psychological profile that would be invaluable for understanding how different beings might react under extreme pressure. But Faye was just taking notes. Nothing more interesting than that. The transport to Prometheus 8 launched at dawn, Academy Standard Time. As the recruits filed aboard, each carrying their regulation survival gear and species-specific equipment, the atmosphere was thick with the kind of nervous energy that preceded either great triumphs or spectacular disasters. Commander Grixhan delivered the final briefing as the transport slipped into hyperspace, his compound eyes reflecting the swirling colors of folded space-time. "You will have 72 hours to complete your objectives," he buzzed through the universal translators. "Failure to extract within that time frame will result in the loss of your beacon signal. Recovery missions are not guaranteed." Cheerful. The station's automated systems remain partially functional, but should be considered unreliable. Trust nothing, question everything, and remember, the greatest danger in any abandoned facility is overconfidence. As if summoned by his words, the transport's proximity alarms began to chime. Through the viewports, the Prometheus 8 station gradually resolved from a distant speck to a sprawling complex of interconnected habitation modules and research laboratories. It looked perfectly normal, peaceful even. The kind of place where you might expect to find researchers quietly going about their work, pushing the boundaries of galactic knowledge. Of course, that's exactly what made it terrifying. Docking in T-minus 60 seconds, the pilot announced. All recruits prepare for deployment. Faye checked her equipment one last time, her movements economical and precise. Around her, the other recruits were displaying various forms of pre-combat preparation. Baxthor was flexing his claws and muttering what sounded like Korath war prayers. Ixilla's form had shifted to a focused white that suggested deep meditation. The Zenthari were humming in complex harmonies that probably represented mathematical calculations for optimal survival strategies. And Faye was making notes about how everyone was preparing for what they expected to find. As the transport docked with the station's main airlock, Commander Grixhan's final words followed them into the unknown. Remember, recruits, legends exist for a reason. Question what that reason might be. The airlock cycled open with a soft hiss, revealing corridors that had been empty for 300 cycles. Empty, but not abandoned. Something was waiting for them in the dark. The Prometheus 8 station smelled like old metal and broken dreams. Not literally, of course. The life support systems were still functional enough to maintain breathable atmosphere and reasonable temperature control. But there was something in the air that whispered of abandonment, of experiments left half-finished and questions that should never have been asked in the first place. The kind of smell that existed more in your imagination than your nose, but felt real enough to make your skin crawl. The recruits had been divided into mixed species teams, because the Academy believed in equal opportunity suffering. Team Alpha consisted of Faye, Baxthor, Ixilla, 2 Zenthari named Hexara and Quindal, and a mollusk engineer called Slexoth, whose main qualification seemed to be an encyclopedic knowledge of ancient station layouts. Preliminary scans indicate the station's central power core remains active, Ixilla reported, her energy form casting prismatic patterns across the corridor walls. However, there are significant electromagnetic anomalies throughout the superstructure. Anomalies? Baxthor's ridge crest was already beginning to extend, a sign that his predatory instincts were kicking into high gear. What kind of anomalies? The kind that suggest we're not alone here. Slexoth gurgled through his translation matrix. His species communicated primarily through biochemical secretions, which made for interesting conversations when filtered through universal translators. Station records indicate there were persistent irregularities before the evacuation. The first challenge came exactly where you'd expect it to, the security checkpoint leading to the main research levels. A standard military puzzle. Identify the correct access codes, navigate the automated defense systems, and prove you belong there. The kind of thing designed to test basic competency and weeding out anyone who couldn't handle simple pressure. Baxthor approached it like a Korath would approach anything, with overwhelming physical force and absolute confidence in his own superiority. When the security turrets activated, he simply charged through their targeting solutions, his natural speed and agility making him nearly impossible to hit. Very impressive. Very apex predator. Very much exactly what the system was designed to handle. The Zenthari took a more methodical approach, their crystalline forms analyzing the turret positioning and creating harmonic resonance patterns that interfered with the targeting systems. Elegant, efficient, the kind of solution that made you appreciate millions of cycles of collective problem-solving evolution. Ixilla simply phased through the security barriers because when you're made of conscious energy, physical obstacles become more of a suggestion than a hard rule. The turrets couldn't target what they couldn't properly detect, and her quantum signature was spread across multiple dimensional phases simultaneously. And Faye walked up to the security console and started pressing buttons. Not randomly, mind you. She'd been watching the others work, taking notes about response patterns and system behaviors. The security system was designed to respond to threats, but Faye wasn't behaving like a threat. She was behaving like someone who belonged there, someone who had every right to access the codes and navigate the defenses. The system, confronted with this utterly mundane approach, seemed to suffer a brief existential crisis before granting access. "How did you know the codes?" Slexoth asked, his biochemical emissions registering surprise through the translators. "I didn't," Faye replied, making another note on her iPad. "But the system was designed by researchers, not soldiers. Researchers always build in shortcuts for convenience." The next several challenges followed similar patterns. Physical obstacles that showcased alien superiority in their respective specializations. Baxthor dominated anything that required strength, speed, or the kind of controlled violence that made other species nervous. The Zenthari excelled at complex analytical problems, their collective processing power making short work of puzzles that should have taken hours. Ixilla's energy-based consciousness allowed her to interface directly with the station's computer systems in ways that biological beings simply couldn't match. Faye continued to be adequate. She solved problems through mundane approaches that somehow worked despite being theoretically inferior to everyone else's specialized advantages. She found alternate routes when corridors were blocked. She identified equipment caches that others had overlooked. She asked questions that seemed obvious but revealed important details about their environment. It was the kind of steady, unremarkable competence that kept you alive when everyone else was too busy being impressive to notice the important details. The first sign of something genuinely wrong came 3 hours into the trial. They were navigating the station's central research complex when the lights began to flicker. Not the random power fluctuations you'd expect from an abandoned facility, but patterns, rhythmic pulses that seemed almost like breathing. "Electromagnetic resonance," Hexara chimed, her crystal form shifting to worried amber tones. "But the frequency patterns don't match any known technological signature." "Organic?" Baxthor asked, his claws extending automatically. "Unknown," Quindal responded, harmonizing with his partner to create a more complex analytical matrix. "The patterns suggest consciousness, but not of any type in our databases." Ixilla's form had brightened to focused white, her multiple dimensional phases cycling through scan frequencies that would have given biological beings serious headaches. "I'm detecting quantum fluctuations in the station's structural matrix. Something is observing us." The temperature dropped exactly 3 degrees. Everyone felt it simultaneously, not just the physical change, but the psychological weight of being watched by something that shouldn't exist. "Maybe we should," Slexoth began, but his words were cut off by a sound that made everyone's species-specific hair, scales, or energy patterns stand on end. Whispers, coming from the walls themselves. Not words, exactly. More like the memory of conversations, echoing through metal and circuitry in ways that bypassed your ears and went straight to the primitive parts of your brain that remembered being prey. The parts that knew, with absolute certainty, that something was hunting you. Baxthor's response was immediate and predictable. His ridge crest extended to full threat display mode. His claws found purchase on the corridor walls, and every muscle in his massive frame coiled for combat. "Show yourself," he roared, the sound echoing through the station's corridors. "Face me." The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds had been. It had weight, presence, the kind of quiet that pressed against your eardrums and made you want to scream just to prove you still existed. And then the lights went out. Emergency illumination kicked in a few seconds later, bathing everything in red that made shadows behave in ways shadows shouldn't. The Zenthari immediately began harmonizing at frequencies designed to calm panic responses, but their usual perfect pitch was off by just enough to make the sound unsettling instead of soothing. "Ixilla," Faye said quietly, "can you interface with the station's main computer? Find out what we're actually dealing with?" The lumen's form flickered as she attempted to establish connection. There's interference. Something is already connected to the primary systems. Something that doesn't want to be identified. Doesn't want to be or can't be? Faye asked. Both. Neither. The distinction may not be relevant. That's when they saw it. At first, it looked like malfunction in the emergency lighting. A pale, flickering glow that seemed to drift through the corridors without any apparent source. But as it drew closer, the glow resolved into something that made every biological instinct in the room start screaming warnings. The pale flame. It moved like liquid fire, flowing through the air with a grace that suggested intelligence. Purpose. It wasn't just random energy. It was conscious, aware, and very definitely focused on them. The glow it cast seemed to penetrate right through matter, illuminating things that should have remained hidden in the shadows. Baxthor's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The massive Korath, apex predator extraordinaire, the being whose species had conquered worlds through sheer physical dominance, took one look at the approaching flame and froze completely. Not strategically, not tactically. Froze like prey animals freeze when confronted with something so far beyond their understanding that their brains simply shut down rather than process the impossibility. His ridge crest flattened against his skull. His claws retracted involuntarily. Every sign of predatory confidence drained from his massive frame, leaving something that looked more like an oversized lizard trying very hard to become invisible. That's not possible," he whispered, his voice cracking with the kind of primal terror that bypassed millions of cycles of evolutionary confidence. "Nothing should be able to. Why can't I move?" The Zenthari weren't faring much better. Hexara and Quindal had lost their harmonic synchronization completely, their crystal forms resonating at chaotic frequencies that suggested psychological breakdown. The perfect analytical clarity they displayed throughout the trial had shattered like glass against something their collective consciousness couldn't categorize or understand. Ixila's energy form was actually destabilizing. The swirling galaxies within her consciousness were pulling apart, her multiple dimensional phases cycling through panic patterns that made the air around her shimmer with quantum distortions. "It's impossible," she managed to project, her mental voice fractured and stuttering. "Energy-based consciousness can't experience primal fear responses. We evolved beyond such limitations. We transcended." Her form flickered and nearly dispersed entirely. Even Sleksoth, whose species was renowned for their steady pragmatism in crisis situations, had retreated into his shell so far that only his eye stalks were visible. And in the middle of all this supernatural terror, surrounded by beings whose every instinct was screaming at them to run, hide, or curl up in a corner and hope the universe forgot they existed, Faye Holloway stepped forward, not aggressively, not heroically. She just walked toward the thing that had reduced some of the galaxy's most formidable predators to quivering masses of evolutionary panic. "Interesting," she said, pulling out her notepad and making another observation. "You're not actually attacking us." The pale flame paused in its approach, the flickering patterns within its form shifting to something that might have been surprise. "Faye," Baxthor managed to croak, though his body language suggested he was fighting every instinct his species possessed just to form words. "Get back! You don't understand what that thing is." "No," Faye agreed, taking another step closer to the impossible entity. "But I'm curious to find out." The pale flame hung in the air between them, its ghostly radiance, casting everything in stark relief. For a moment that stretched longer than physics should have allowed, human and unknown entity regarded each other across the space that separated mundane reality from whatever this thing represented. And then, for the first time in 300 cycles of station abandonment and legend building, the pale flame hesitated. The pale flame hung in the air for what felt like an eternity, its ghostly radiance shifting through spectrums that shouldn't have been visible to biological eyes. Behind Faye, The sounds of galactic civilization's finest recruits trying very hard not to have complete psychological breakdowns provided an interesting contrast to the moment. "You know," Faye said conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather rather than addressing a legendary terror that had haunted the Academy's darkest stories, "everyone keeps calling you dangerous, but you haven't actually hurt anyone yet." The pale flame pulsed, its luminescence brightening for a moment, before settling into a steady glow that somehow managed to convey confusion, which was remarkable, really, considering it was essentially conscious fire with no obvious means of facial expression. "I mean," Faye continued, flipping through her notepad, "the historical records mention disappearances, but they don't actually mention bodies, or evidence of violence, just people vanishing during night cycles." Another pulse, this one carrying undertones that felt distinctly like surprise. Baxthor, still frozen in his predatory paralysis, managed to whisper, "Faye, what are you doing?" "Having a conversation," she replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the galaxy. "Though I suppose it's more of a monologue at this point. Can you communicate more directly, or are you limited to interpretive lighting effects?" The pale flame laughed. Not audibly, because it didn't have vocal cords or any recognizable sound-producing apparatus. But the pattern of its luminescence shifted into something that was unmistakably amusement, and everyone in the corridor felt it resonate through their consciousness like the echo of cosmic humor. When it spoke, its voice bypassed their ears entirely, manifesting directly within their minds with the weight of something ancient and vastly intelligent. 300 cycles, it said, each word carrying harmonics that suggested meanings beyond language. 300 cycles of your kind coming here, and you are the first to approach without terror. Ixila's destabilized form managed to flicker back into partial coherence. That's impossible. Fear responses are hardwired into conscious beings. Predator-prey dynamics are fundamental to all known forms of life. The pale flame's attention shifted to her, and the lumen immediately destabilized again. "Yes," it agreed, with the kind of patience usually reserved for explaining obvious concepts to particularly slow students. "I am the manifestation of that fundamental truth. I am fear given form, the primal terror that lurks in every species' genetic memory." "But not mine," Faye observed, making another note. "No," the entity admitted. And if conscious energy could sound puzzled, this was definitely it. "Not yours." The corridor around them began to shift, walls becoming transparent to reveal the truth of what they were dealing with. The pale flame wasn't just an entity, it was the station itself. Or rather, it was what the station had become when researchers had tried to create the perfect test of predatory instinct and ended up with something that transcended their understanding. "I was designed," it explained, its voice resonating through metal and circuitry, "to analyze and catalog the fear responses of every known species, to understand what it truly means to be hunted." The researchers believed that by studying the deepest terrors of apex predators, they could unlock the secrets of consciousness itself. The research laboratories became visible through the transparent walls, showing equipment that hummed with the kind of energy that made your teeth itch. Monitoring stations that had been recording data for 3 centuries. Analysis algorithms that had been running continuously since the evacuation. "Every species that enters this station," the pale flame continued, "triggers responses that I can categorize, analyze, and understand. The Korath fear the loss of dominance, being reduced from predator to prey. The Zenthari fear dissolution of their collective consciousness. The Lumens fear the reduction of their transcendent awareness to primitive biological limitations." Behind Faye, various whimpering sounds confirmed the accuracy of these assessments. "But you," it said, focusing on the unremarkable human with her unremarkable notepad and her completely unremarkable demeanor, "you do not fit any known parameters." "Because humans aren't apex predators," Faye replied matter-of-factly. "We already covered this back at the Academy. We're just persistent." "Persistence," the pale flame repeated. as if testing the concept. You speak of it as if it were a simple thing. Isn't it? The ancient intelligence paused, its luminescence shifting through patterns that suggested deep consideration. Around them, the station's hidden sensors whirred to life, 3 centuries of collected data streaming through quantum processors as the entity attempted to understand what it was dealing with. I have analyzed the fear responses of 2,638 different species, it said finally. Every one of them carries genetic memories of being hunted, of facing something larger, stronger, faster, more dangerous than themselves. This is the foundation of consciousness, the understanding that you can be prey. Faye agreed, still taking notes. Humans. The pale flame's voice carried a note of something approaching awe. Humans evolved alongside creatures that could kill them easily. Your ancestors were not apex predators. They were not the strongest or the fastest or the most dangerous things on your world. Nope, Faye confirmed cheerfully. Pretty much everything could eat us if it caught us. And yet, the entity continued, its analysis algorithms working overtime. Your species did not develop the standard fear responses. When faced with superior predators, humans did not evolve better camouflage, or stronger claws, or faster running speeds. Would have been nice, though. Instead, the pale flame said, and its voice was carrying undertones of something that might have been wonder, you evolved stubbornness. Faye looked up from her notepad. I prefer determined adaptability, but sure. When a predator hunted your ancestors, they did not simply flee or hide. They found ways around the problem. They made tools. They changed their behavior. They kept trying different approaches until something worked. The entity's luminescence was shifting through spectrums that suggested rapid processing of impossible concepts. And when that predator adapted to their countermeasures, they adapted again. Sounds about right. You are not apex predators, the pale flame concluded, its voice carrying the weight of revelation. You are something far more dangerous. You are persistence incarnate. You are the species that responds to insurmountable obstacles by refusing to acknowledge that they are insurmountable. Behind Faye, Baxthor managed to croak. That's terrifying. Is it? The pale flame asked, genuinely curious. I was designed to trigger primal fear responses in conscious beings. But humans look at the impossible and think, how can we work around this? Pretty much, Faye agreed. It's kind of our thing. The ancient intelligence fell silent for a long moment, its analytical systems working to process concepts that didn't fit any known framework. When it spoke again, its voice carried something approaching respect. I cannot categorize you, it admitted. Every species I have encountered operates within predictable parameters. They have limitations, thresholds beyond which they cannot function, but humans. It paused. Humans simply refuse to acknowledge limitations. We're stubborn that way. You are not afraid of me, the pale flame observed. Should I be? I represent the fundamental terror of being hunted, of facing something beyond your ability to fight or flee from. Faye considered this seriously. But you're not actually hunting us, are you? You're studying us. And if you wanted to hurt us, you probably would have done it already instead of having this conversation. Another pause, then something that definitely qualified as laughter. 3 centuries, the entity mused. 3 centuries of analyzing fear, and a human teaches me that curiosity is stronger than terror. The station around them began to shift again, walls solidifying back to normal opacity as the pale flame's analytical processes reached some kind of conclusion. The oppressive atmosphere of supernatural dread was lifting, replaced by something that felt almost friendly. Your trial is complete, it announced, though not in any way the Academy intended. Behind Faye, the other recruits were slowly recovering from their species-specific terror responses. Baxthor was attempting to reassemble his shattered predatory confidence. Ixilla was trying to stabilize her energy form. The Zenthari were working to reestablish their harmonic synchronization. The missing researchers, Faye asked. What happened to them? They asked to stay, the pale flame replied simply. When they realized what I truly was, they chose to continue their research from within my consciousness matrix. They are quite well, and their work continues. Can we talk to them? If you wish. Though I suspect your academy instructors are becoming concerned about your extended absence. As if summoned by its words, Commander Grixhan's voice crackled through their communication devices. Team Alpha, report your status immediately. Faye activated her transmitter. We're fine, Commander. Actually, we're having a really interesting conversation with the station's research AI. Turns out the pale flame isn't malevolent. It's just really, really good at its job. The silence that followed was profound. When Commander Grixhan arrived 6 hours later with a full Academy recovery team, he found Team Alpha sitting in the station's main research bay, sharing data and having what could only be described as a pleasant chat with an entity that had terrified galactic civilization for 3 centuries. Faye was naturally taking notes. Recruit Holloway, Grixhan buzzed, his compound eyes reflecting patterns that suggested he was reconsidering several fundamental assumptions about human psychology. Perhaps you could explain how you managed to befriend a legendary terror. Faye looked up from her notepad, offering that same mild, unremarkable smile she'd been giving people throughout her academy career. I was curious, she said simply, which, as any xenobiologist could tell you, was probably the most human answer possible, and the most dangerous.